Well, some of this is a recapitulation of what Lee and Alan have already said, but you'll see where I'm going with it. The Spanish missions of the late 18th and 19th centuries and early 19th centuries kept scrupulous records of births, deaths, marriages, and baptisms that are very useful for the Muwekma Ohlone today, recording the names of specific identifiable ancestors, as well as the names of village sites from which newly baptized individuals, the neophytes, were originated. The village of Ohlone, O-L-J-O-N is how it's been spelled. In Spanish, we pronounce that Ohlone, was located on the coast of what's now San Mateo County, south of the city of San Francisco. This name changed into Ohlone and Ohlonian, terms that were used by families from all over this region, starting at least in the mid-19th century, probably before, to refer to themselves. The name Muwekma, which means, as we've said several times since this morning, la gente, or the people, in the East Bay Ohlone language Chocheño, was used by the Ohlones in a post-mission period Ohlone village, Alisal, that we'll be talking about more and that has already been mentioned, to refer to themselves, which was reported by linguist John P. Harrington in the early 1930s. Very frequently in the 19th and 20th centuries, the Ohlones of Alisal and elsewhere in the East Bay and South Bay referred to themselves as Mission Indians. In the case of those in the East Bay, Mission San Jose Indians, and down here, Mission Santa Clara Indians. I began learning about these names when I started working for the Muwekma Ohlone Tribe in 1991 as an ethnographer and as an ethnohistorian. In this capacity, I substantiated the use of the ethnonyms Muwekma by Harrington in his notes and of Ohlone around 1850 in dealings between scholars, the federal government, and Muwekma ancestors. During the mission period, the extraordinary demographic crash of coastal Native California peoples and societies occurred under the impact of new and inferior diets, exposure to new diseases for which there was no immunity, and the overcrowded and unhealthful conditions in the mission dormitories. By the early 19th century, this led the padres of the missions and the soldiers in the nearby presidios to travel far afield to forcibly convert and recruit whole new core of neophytes into the existing missions. The mixing of individuals and groups from previously distinct villages, language regions, and kin groups, and a reformulated set of identities tied to each mission, and often via the utilization of one or two common languages. Ohlone peoples from the South Bay, East Bay, and peninsular villages interned at Mission San Jose, for example, were brought together with people who originated in much more distant villages where Miwok and Yokuts languages were spoken. Following the independence of Mexico and the secularization of the missions in the mid-1850s, following Mexico's independence, many of the neophytes, and I should say it's earlier than that the secularization began, many of the neophytes interned at Mission San Jose retreated from the site of the mission to work on Mexican ranches in and around the old mission site. In the 1850s, following the admission of California as a U.S. state, Muwekma ancestors who were by then descended from the many peoples interned at Mission San Jose and other missions, as well as from, the Mission Santa Clara and Mission Dolores, moved away from the post-secularization residential areas, which were located too close to the main areas of white settlement on the rim of the East Bay. And they moved to a large land grant in the Livermore Valley, east of the Diablo Range, called the Bernal Rancheria. On the top of a site that had been a pre-contact village, Ohlone families from Mission San Jose created the new village that I've already mentioned, and that's already been mentioned this morning, Alisal, which in Spanish means the alder grove. Alisal is where the majority of self-identified Ohlones, Mission San Jose Indians of the Bay Area lived in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In what is now the southernmost part of the smaller city of Pleasanton, with a smaller number living in neighboring Niles and Sunol. Anthropologists such as C. Hart Merriam began visiting Alisal at the end of the 19th century and recorded that the people there worked mainly as vaqueros, or cowboys, and spoke the East Bay Ohlone language Chocheño, in which the term Muwekma was used self-referentially, as well as speaking a Plains Miwok language referred to as Kik. At Alisal, Muwekma ancestors wove a tight web of connection, relationship, and community leadership through ritual godparent responsibilities, the commemoration of funerals and births, and the renascent traditional dance ceremonies, which we have already seen some regalia from in both presentations, which included the local variant of the ghost dance as recorded by ethnographer Edward Gifford. Gifford described a thriving cultural revival in which ghost dance leaders who were intrinsic members of the Alisal community acted to spread the ritual to other tribes up and down the California coast. Although the ranch where Alisal was located was originally part of a land grant made under the Mexican regime to the California or Hispanic Californian Bernal family, by the end of the 19th century, this property had passed into the hands of the widow of gold mining multimillionaire and later U.S. Senator George Hearst and his wife, Phoebe Apperson Hearst. The arrangement by which Alisal existed and persisted in the East Bay lands of the Hearsts was therefore informal in every sense. The Ohlone did not have anything like title to the land on which their village stood, and they were already considered landless or homeless Indians in the early years of the 20th century. Indeed, in 1904, the Northern California Indian Association petitioned the 58th Congress on behalf of the landless Indians of Northern and Central California. An attachment to their document listed the number of Indians, the languages they spoke, and their county of residence. The 1905 to 1906 Special Indian Census, conducted by Agent C.E. Kelsey, not only recorded the Indian villages at Pleasanton and Niles, but also listed some of their families living there, as well as reiterating the landless condition of the native communities and the need to buy land for them. By 1913, the Alisal Indian community had become known among the Indian agents from Sacramento, and to no one else, particularly among the Ohlones themselves, as the Verona Band. Why? Because a private railroad station for the use of the Hearsts and their friends was constructed near the edge of the settlement, and they called this Verona Station. Railroad track workers accidentally started a fire in 1915, which burned both the station and the homes of the Ohlones of Alisal. From 1914 until 1927, the Reno and then Sacramento Indian agencies filed reports that showed the presence of Ohlone people at Pleasanton and Niles, recording their names and repeatedly iterating the Verona Band misnomer. The late 1920s witnessed an effort on the part of the Indian agency located in Reno, and then in 1923 in Sacramento, to redress the so-called homeless Indian problem, quote unquote, the homeless Indian problem. This problem had been caused by three conjunctural processes. First, the relentless removal of indigenous Californians from most of their territories, which began with statehood in the mid-19th century. Second, the state's political campaign in the 1920s to prevent the U.S. Congress from signing those 18 treaties that you've heard about with California's tribes, which would have established a much more extensive reservation system. And third, the effects of California's already massive agro-industries that demanded a poorly paid itinerant workforce that moved from one harvest to the next. In the first third of the 20th century, the dominant crops in Northern California were hops, apples, and wheat, and the migrant labor force was the adult Indian population that literally had nowhere else to go. Then, as now, the sensibilities of white middle-class Californians were offended by the unsightliness of migrant camps. And then, as now, the solution was merely a Band-Aid. Starting at the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the federal government agreed to purchase small homesteads for groups of Indians identifiable as bands, groups that were then, through this process, federally recognized, and among these federally recognized groups was the Verona Band. Yet, in 1927, the Sacramento Agency Superintendent Lafayette Dorrington omitted the federally recognized status of over 100 bands, with his unilateral decision not to request funds for the purchase of rancheria properties. For Alisal, which apparently he never visited, because he did use the term Verona Band, Dorrington wrote, quote, "There is one band in Alameda County, commonly known as the Verona Band, which consists of about 30 individuals located near the town of Verona." I don't think there's a Verona right in the East Bay. The Indians were formerly those that resided in close proximity to Mission San Jose. That's how we know he never went there. It does not appear at the present time, that there is any need for the purchase of land for the establishment of their homes. So he never went there, and he removed them from the list along with over another 100 bands. Indian tribes can only be legally terminated by an act of Congress, and this never occurred. Lafayette Dorrington's decision to remove the Verona band from the list of tribes for whom land should be purchased functioned such that the relationship between the federal government and Muwekma's ancestors was therefore afterwards ignored. But this has never had any de jure significance or truth value. This history, which you've heard parts of now, in several other presentations, leads up to what happened in 1996, when, based upon evidence presented in the Muwekma Petition, the OFA identified that period between 1914 and 1927 as a period of unambiguous recognition of the Verona band, which the subsequent federal court rulings elaborated by stating that the Muwekma Ohlone were unequivocally the descendants of the Verona band. And those were those quotes that we started with. With this initial determination, BAR/OFA instructed Muwekma that their response should focus only on the period after 1927 and would not even consider any information before 1914. This meant that the important data about recognition prior to 1914, such as the Kelsey census, was disregarded, as well as absolutely key information explaining who the misnomed Verona band was and why that misnomer acted to obscure extensive and relevant aspects of Muwekma history. In effect, this preliminary declaration made entire areas of Muwekma history illegible, that initial determination. The tribe, in effect, appears to vanish before 1914. With the final determination, the destructive force of illegibility became even more powerful, if not more straining, of credibility. In OFA's final and negative determination of the Muwekma Petition, based once again on the monumental weight of evidence in the petition, the reviewers were forced to reconsider and stated that the Ohlone Tribe Incorporated, which was comprised entirely of the descendants of the previously recognized Verona band that they said existed between 1914 and 1927, that this entity called the Ohlone Tribe Incorporated, organized in the mid-1960s to protect the Ohlone Cemetery at the old Mission San Jose from freeway construction, they were forced to reconsider the Ohlone Tribe Incorporated. The cemetery had been deeded by the Catholic Church to the American Indian Historical Society, led by Rupert Costo, the tribal chair of the Cahuilla tribe in Southern California, who in 1971 titled the property to Ohlone Tribe Incorporated. Looking into the past, the Ohlone Tribe membership was entirely Verona band people. Looking ahead, the Ohlone Tribe was comprised entirely of families who became the membership of the Muwekmas. I quote here from the final determination. New oral history evidence shows that the members of the petitioning group, in other words, Muwekma, and their ancestors, who were among the people on the IAHS, that's the American Indian Historical Society's list of Ohlone contacts, participated in activities in the 1960s with members of the Galvan family who were on the IHS's list of members. A reevaluation of the documentary evidence from the late 1960s, informed by this new oral history evidence, leads to a revised conclusion that there is a reasonable likelihood that between 1965 and 1971, Rupert and Jeanette Costo of the IAHS identified an Ohlone Indian entity that was the precursor to the petitioning group, in other words, Muwekma. This was further restated further on. Quote, the new oral history evidence submitted during the comment period provides a basis for revising the proposed finding and concluding that there is a reasonable likelihood that the identification by the Costos of a group of Ohlone descendants was an identification of a group consisting of members and ancestors of members of the petitioning group.